start that conversation again. Someone was asking me a moment ago, or actually it was last night, about what's the significance of going back and looking at Africa's contribution to the Bible when we have issues of racial brutality now, and we have issues of inequality in the American court system. How's that going to help us? Well, it's going to help us if we understand who we are. I'm mindful of an African proverb that says a man who does not know his history is like a tree who has lost contact with its roots. And I think that that's a wonderful picture. So listen, this is going to be a 4-week conversation. The material that I have to cover will last roughly 1 hour, and maybe a little less. Then right after that, you will have some time to ask questions. Just in terms of housekeeping, if you asked in advance, we provided you with an outline, which is like a syllabus, and a workbook so that you can work through this material and you can be somewhat familiar with it. So when we lecture about it, it won't seem like German or French, but if you didn't have the opportunity to get the material, you can get the material by going to Freedom Ministries page on Facebook, and Freedom Ministries page on Facebook has the syllabus and the workbook. And this material is designed to share. I mean, there are links, there are videos, there's advanced reading on every topic that we're going to approach today and throughout the course. And if you really want to get into this conversation, if it whets your appetite, by all means, I want you to share it with your friends and your family. This is designed to create a conversation. I am not a student, or rather an expert on any topic that is going to be covered today, but I am a very serious student on history, world history, Black history, African history. And for the last 3 years, I would say, I've been studying what archaeologists and Egyptologists would call Nile River civilizations, Nile Valley River civilizations, or Nile River Valley civilizations. I'll get that out. But what that is the study of three countries or 3 empires, and those 3 countries and empires are mentioned in the Bible. So that's why it's relevant for us to discuss them. Anything that's in the Bible, I think, is important. So what are those 3 civilizations that are going to figure and loom largely in our conversation for the next 4 weeks? Egypt, which we will refer to as Kush, or rather, I'm sorry, Kemet. Kemet meaning the land of the blacks. And then Kush, the second mighty empire, which was just to the south of the border of Egypt, or Kemet. And then lastly, we will look at an empire that I'm sure most people don't know about, a mighty African empire that existed for 1,000 years, and that's Oxum. If you want to do the advanced reading, it's in the material. Again, if you don't have the course outline, you can go to Freedom Ministries page, Facebook page. We put a link up there so that you can get the entire workbook as well as the outline, and you can read ahead. At the end of this conversation today, we are going to be able to ask questions. In the meantime, as we go through, if you have questions, put them in the chat, and when we get to a certain point, we'll address those questions. So because there's so much material to cover in so little time, it's time for us to get right to our conversation. Let's do that. So in our last year's discussion, we talked about the fact that the nation of Egypt is actually a name that was given to it by the not the Egyptians, but the Greeks. The original name was called Egyptus. That's what they called it, but that is not what the people who lived in that country or in that empire or in that region called it. They called it Kemet. They didn't use vowels in the way that we use vowels. So the hieroglyphics, which are the pictorial writings which symbolizes thought, was decoded by a guy named Champollion. He was a French explorer sometime in the mid 1800s. The archaeologists knew about these writings, and they tried for years to decode them, and they couldn't. But they found something that was called the Rosetta Stone. And what happened is the Rosetta Stone was written in 3 languages, Arabic, Greek, and in the Kemetic language, or the Egyptian language. So they understood that by looking at the message in Greek, which most scholars could decode or understood, they could then, by reference, figure out what was being said in hieroglyphics. So in hieroglyphics, clearly and consistently, the people who lived in what we know today as Egypt referred to their land as Kemet. And Kemet means land of the blacks. Now, I got to tell you that my exhaustive discussion and investigation and research of why they refer to themselves as Kemet, or their country as Kemet, is something that is in debate. And I think the original archaeologists or the Egyptologists, such as George Reisner is the one that I will make reference to. We know that he was influenced by his prejudice, by his perceptions that Black people were ignorant, that Black people had no history, that Black people were incapable of having an advanced civilization in the way that they saw this. So they immediately dismissed the possibility that something so marvelous, something so spectacular could be created by Black people. So he was blinded by his prejudice. There's ample independent, objective evidence that supports that George Reisner, who was a Harvard professor of Egyptology, was blinded by his prejudice. He couldn't imagine in his wildest dream that Black people could be so intelligent. Now, in our last year's discussion, we talked about the fact that although that is the most recent perspective that Europeans had. When I say most recent, it's relative, because in this conversation, we're having a conversation about things that happened 3,000, 4,000, maybe in some instances, we'll go back to 7,000 years of African history. So when I talk about what George Reisner was doing and thinking about Black people 100 years ago, please understand that's relatively recent history. So then George Reisner looked at this information, and initially he and other European Egyptologists and archaeologists said, this has to have been some white people who came to Africa and built this magnificent civilization, and somehow they left. Now, there was no objective evidence, there was no archaeological evidence, there was nothing to support this wild theory, but this wild theory was put together to support their prejudicial views about Black people. And from that point up until the very present hour, when Egypt is discussed, strategically, it is referred to as being in the Middle East. And it's not in the Middle East, folks. Geographically, it is on the continent of Africa, but that is very subtle conversation, and there's a subtle way in which this topic is being approached, because they do not still, many of these scientists that are still influenced by their prejudice do not want to admit that these Africans, these brothers and sisters from Kemet, were so advanced. But I'm getting to a point here. I say the recent Europeans had that view, not the Greeks, not the Romans. And if you access the material, because we don't have the time to do everything that we want to do and need to do today, so I'm going to hit the high points. But the Greeks actually traveled to Kemet to study science, to study astronomy, to study medicine, to study philosophy, to study theoretical mathematics. Pythagoras, who is a mathematician who we know in America today in terms of geometry and other theorems, he was a person who spent time studying math in Kemet, in Africa. And there was a guy who's recognized as the first historian by all Europeans. His name is Herodotus. Herodotus spent a lot of time visiting and traveling throughout Africa and making observations and being amazed and saying that Africa, and he described the people as being dark-skinned with curly hair. So they weren't the people that you see on TV, Yul Brynner, white male, bald head. No, that was not who they were. They were Black people. And there's a continuing discussion about who these Egyptian people were. Now, why is that important? Why is any of this important? Well, the first thing that I note in our conversation about Kemet is that the word Egypt, which we're now going to continue to say Kemet, is mentioned 611 times in the Bible. So anything or anybody that is mentioned that amount of times in the Bible has some significance. Now, so how then did this country that we know today as Kemet come to be known as Kemet as opposed to Egypt? Well, let's talk about things that we talked about last year that I think is important to do in terms of refreshing. Well, we know that after the flood, which is discussed in the 6th chapter of the book of Genesis, the 7th, and then after the flood ended and Moses comes out, and the Bible tells us that Noah had 3 sons, right? His oldest son was Shem, his middle son was Ham, and his third son was Japheth. And Ham had 4 sons. One of them was Cush, and one of them was Mizraim, and another was Canaan. So, but Ham, I want to focus on Ham for a moment. That name Ham or Ham is the derivative. Ham, if we look in the links that are there, means hot. It is a reference to a place where there's a hot climate. If you look at some of the maps, and now I'm going to try to share my screen with you in just a moment here, and we're coming up on our first attempt to share material. I want to see if I can share my screen with you in just a moment here. Let's see. Give me a second here and tell me what you see. Can you see the map?
Yeah, I see the map.
Okay, now we're getting into the course material. So can you see where the name Ham is? Now, in the pink or peach colored area, what we see is all the places where the descendants of Noah's second son, Ham, set up shop, for lack of a better term, where they lived. And if you'll notice to the far left of the screen at the top, we see the name Egypt. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
And then below that, what you see is Cush. You see that?
Right.
And then all the way down to the bottom of that, you see the name Havilah.
Yes, sir.
Havilah. You see that?
Uh-huh. Yes, sir.
And then if you go across the ocean, and that's really the Red Sea, you see Sheba.
Right.
All right. So these are all the places, and let's go up and over to the right. You see Assyria and Nineveh.
Yes, I see it.
If you're somewhat biblically literate, you know that these are places that figure largely in the discussion of the Bible and the events of the Bible, right? Assyrian was a great empire that menaced Israel on multiple occasions, and Babel, the Tower of Babel, all of these places were developed or created by the sons of Ham. Or another way of saying this for the context of this conversation, all those people were Black. How do we know that? Well, we know that Ham was Black. And I don't think that that's debated. Well, if Ham was Black, then the question is, what color was his father? I mean, that just logically, right? Biologically, genetically speaking, if you're Black, maybe your one of your parents has to be Black. That's a given. But then if we know also this, that Ham had one of Ham's sons was Cush, right? That's his oldest son. We know that Cush means Black. What we're going to get into and we're going to discover in our conversation later is that the country that we know today as Sudan, right? Actually now Sudan has been divided into 2 countries, Sudan and Southern Sudan. But for the most part, we know the country Sudan as being currently just south of the modern day country of Egypt. But do you know what the name Sudan actually means, the origin of that name? It's an Arabic term, and it literally means the black land. So let's put those two things together. If Kemet means the land of the blacks and Sudan means the black land, then we can talk confidently about the fact that this region that we're looking at on our map is the place where black people lived. And by extension, Africa is the land of the blacks. So now that's important. Now let's get back. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and we're going to get back to our conversation. So Kemet existed a remarkable period of time. And I just want to put this in some type of historical context. I've already told you that Kemet is significant because it's mentioned in the Bible 611 times. And the title of this conversation is Africa's Contribution to the People and the Places of the Bible. So now when we're talking about Kemet, we're talking about one of the places that is discussed significantly in the Bible. And we'll talk about in just a moment why it is discussed significantly in the Bible. But now let's talk about the empire. You know, when we hear about the Exodus, we hear about Joseph going into Egypt, being sold into slavery. What was that place like? Let's see if we can paint a picture. Let's create a movie or an image in your mind. Well, what you should know is that Kemet existed from 3100 BCE or before Christ to right at 27, or some historians say 24 BC. So it existed for roughly 3,100 years. It was a great empire. It was a long-lasting empire. Let's contrast that to the United States of America. But the United States of America currently, which claims to be the greatest empire, the greatest nation that ever lived on the face of planet Earth, has been in existence for 247 years. Kemet existed for 3,100 years. So let that sit with you for a moment, because that's in the context of history. And I'm going to now slide down and I'm going to share my screen with you so you can further appreciate what I'm saying. So you can see the life of empires. I'm going to share the screen with you if I can get to this in just a moment. Can you see?
I see it.
Chart. Now, what I've done here, folks, for your edification, just to give you some idea of how powerful Kemet was historically. And we don't get this in our classes in world history. I spent a lot of time as I was preparing this material looking at how Kemet is addressed in world history. We know about Greece, right? We know about Rome, right? Mm-hmm. We know about Persia. We may even know about Assyria. But look, you can see at the top of the chart what I told you, right? Mm-hmm. That Kemet, the beginning of Kemet was 3100 BC. It ended, according to this chart, 30 BCE. Kush, which is the next nation we're going to talk about, started at 2500 BCE, ended 350 CE, which is after Christ. It lasted 2,850 years. You've heard of the Sumerians or the Sumerians, and I'm not talking about the Samaritans. Sumer, have any of you heard of the Empire of Sumer? If you haven't, you should look it up. But basically, Sumer is the land that we refer to, secular archaeologists and historical experts refer to as Mesopotamia. And what Mesopotamia means is the land between the rivers, the great rivers of the Tigris River and the Euphrates. But you will see a lot of people who are not fans of Kemet celebrating Sumer and the fact that it was an advanced civilization. In fact, it was. But if you look at what the Sumerians said about themselves, they refer to themselves as the black-headed people. Do you see that on my chart?
Mm-hmm.
The black-headed people. So I'm just throwing out tidbits because I want you to do the further inquiry based upon what I'm telling you, because I could be saying something right or I could be saying something wrong. I want for you to get into the practice of doing your due diligence, being like the Bereans in the Bible. They listened respectfully to the Apostle Paul, and then they went back and they studied the scriptures to see whether or not what he was saying was actually accurate. But let's go down our chart here. Look at the Babylonians. How long did they last? That great empire, how long did it last?
626 years.
All right. How about Assyria? How long did Assyria last?
900 years.
Let's go. You want to know what the duration is, by the way. Babylon, you have to go to the far right. 626 is when it started. 539 is when it ended. So how long is that? You see
Babylon,
that?
87 years.
87
Babylon.
Years. Assyria, 300 years. Persia,
300 years.
228 years. Greece, that is celebrated, right? When you study world history, you know about Greece. It's this powerful thing. It's like no one ever did what the Greeks did, but how long did it last?
453 years.
What about the great Roman Empire? 503 years. How about the French Empire? 330 years. You can, and so on, so on. And you go all the way down to the mighty and the powerful United States. How long?
246 years.
You know, one way of looking at this, guys, and this is about, yeah, to some extent, giving you some black pride, some information that has been intentionally withheld from you, I believe, to make you think that you don't have a past. And the import of being told that and believing that is also that it has an impact on your ability to think about what you can do in the future. Okay, now we're out of the screen. Can you hear me? Or can you see me and hear me?
Yes.
All right, so I'm gonna go back to the material that I need to continue to share with you. Kemet, back to Kemet. Kemet was formed by two separate empires living near the Nile River. The reason why they had the ability to form this long-lasting empire is because they lived near a river. If you know human history and world history, what you know is that every major civilization that has ever existed and lasted for a long time, and I'll put that caveat out there, is a civilization that was formed by a mighty river. Well, let's do some quick review. We're talking about Kemet, and what is the mighty river that it was formed by? The Nile River. You know that the Nile River is the longest river in the world, the longest. But let's talk about some other civilizations. How about China? Did you know that the rivers, there are two rivers that form the basis for the Chinese to create their civilization, which is at least 5,000 years old, maybe longer than that, older than that. But there it's the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, which I had a chance to do a cruise on back in 2017, the Yangtze River. So wherever there's water, there's the ability to grow food, there's the ability to drink, and there's ability to live and to stay in one place. We know from human history, world history, that human beings started out being what we call hunter-gatherers. They moved, they had to hunt and gather their food continually. But when they found themselves near a river and the river overflowed its banks, it created a rich soil which they could grow food in. And that's the story where you find many major civilizations. Babylon, the great Assyria, they're all on rivers. Even England, London is on the Thames River. And we can just go on and on in terms of rivers and civilizations. But let's get back to Kemet. So there was Upper Kemet and Lower Kemet. Those were two separate groups of people. I mean, in this two separate empires, they were related culturally, ethnically, they had the same religion, the same god, the same main god, who they referred to as the invisible one. You know, as with all other let's say, Christian nations in the past. Kemet in the past had many gods, but they had one God that they thought was the king of gods. And they referred to him as the invisible one, the one who was everyone but yet unseen, the concept of God, one who could not be seen. But anyway, so the upper Kemet and the lower Kemet shared many of the same things, but yet they were two separate entities until a gentleman by the name of Namar united them. Namar united them, and I'm going to show you a picture of Namar, because one of the questions that, as I said to you earlier, is continually being debated is what color was Namar? What color was the Egyptians? And I don't know why that's a problem, why that is an issue, but I suspect they're still grappling with the fact that Black people would have the ability to do the wonderful and the remarkable and amazing things that were done in Kemet 3,000, 4,000 years ago. So let me share the screen here, guys, and I want to hear your opinion about what you think, what this guy looks like. All right, can you see my screen now?
Yes, sir.
All right, this gentleman to the far left, you see where my
Cursor?
Pharaoh Narmar. Well, that's the first Narmar, yeah. What does he look like to you?
Like a Black man to me.
I mean, look at that nose.
Yep.
That is the first Pharaoh. He's the one that united Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt together and formed what we call the first dynasty that existed in Kemet. So to me, in my mind, the question is clearly resolved. I look at the evidence. Now, here, let me tell you what the white Europeans said back then when they were finally able to decode using the Rosetta Stone, that these people referred to their land as the Black Land, or the land of the Blacks. What they said was, no, that was a reference to the soil. Because when the Nile River overflowed its banks seasonally, it deposited this rich Black soil. So the people were referring to the soil, not to themselves. Well, let's be objective about this, folks. Let's look at Narmer again. What do you think? Black man? So we got a Black looking man, right? And we got their words saying, hey, we live in the land of the Blacks. What is the objective evidence show? Now, what you'll know is, let's go all the way over here to the right. You see this guy here?
Yes, sir.
His name is Mentuhotep II. Mentuhotep II was a guy who was the pharaoh at the beginning of the second reimagining or the regathering of the Empire of Kemet. Let me explain something. That Kemet went through periods where the central government disintegrated. And then the pharaohs would lose power and the priest, and there was this continuing tension between the priest and the pharaohs. The priests would gain power and they would form these local fiefdoms. And so who was in control of Egypt would be up for grabs. So archaeologists and Egyptologists call these periods, and there were three periods that they call these the intermediate periods, all right? So during the intermediate periods, it was anybody who had an army that would support them and anybody who had influence. But then for some reason, and the reason was that they were simply related. You know, empires rise and fall all the time. And I think that the chart that I showed you a moment ago illustrates the point that really no empire lasts forever. Even Kemet, which lasted for 3,100 years, and Kush, which lasted for just short of 3,000 years, had its beginnings, had its apex, and had its end. And so we know with every world power that exists today, we know ultimately what will happen. The question is not if, it's just how and when, because that's the course of human history. But anyway, getting back to this Amenhotep II, he, after the first intermediate period, he reformed the nation. And so he became the pharaoh of the rebirth of Kemet. And I showed you his picture because what did he look like to you? Did he look like a
Black man.
European, or did he look like a black?
He looked like a black man.
He looked like a black man. Now, the thing is that we've been lied to. The thing is that we have been intentionally misled. The thing is that in Oxford, which is supposed to be one of the most, intellectually rigorous learning institutions in the world, that predates Harvard, which is supposed to be our premier university in the United States of America. As recently as the 1970s, the professors of history and of archaeology were teaching the students at Oxford that Africa has no history. None, zero. The only history that we have is the history that happened at the point in which the Europeans encountered us. So that's the importance of this lesson. It's the importance of this lesson generally, but now let's get back to our biblical conversation, because what we're talking about is Africa's contribution to the Bible. Now then, let's go on. So we know that Africa was this place, it wasn't a backwater, it was a highly developed, highly refined civilization. And how did it get so? Because it was located near a river. When people have time to contemplate the meaning of life, then they begin to develop technology. They begin to delve into the science. When they have enough food to eat, when they have a place to live, then they devote themselves to other pursuits. And that's what happened in Kemet. They were able to not only grow enough food to feed themselves today, tomorrow, but actually to have storehouses. And so once your basic needs are met, then you can go to the arts and the sciences. And this is what happened early on in Kemet. We know something else. And this is something that we discussed last year, and I think is important to refresh this in this particular session today as well. We know that scientists tell us that humanity, that everyone that is living today is related to people who came from what is called the Great Rift Valley. And I'm giving you a lot of information. You're going to have to actually go to the material and look it up and read it, because we're running out of time, but it's important for you to get the foundation, because we're going to be building on the material as we go. But they tell us that that all living people came from the Great Rift Valley. They also tell us that every living person comes from a woman that scientists refer to as Mitochondria Eve, not to be confused with the Eve of the Bible, but she is referred to as Eve, Mitochondria Eve, because using her mitochondria, which is the center of the cell, scientists are able to determine who your mother's 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 mother is in that way. So that is how they can track you genetically all the way back to your first mother. And through that process, scientists has been able to determine that every single person on planet Earth is linked to and related to this woman who was found on the east coast of Africa. And thus she's referred to as Mitochondria Eve. But what we also know is that humanity began in the Great Rift Valley, began to migrate northward along the eastern coast of Africa into what we know today as Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Djibouti, Kenya, Tanzania, some people call it Tanzania, Uganda, all the way up eventually to Kemet, which we know as Egypt. So everybody in this world is Black. And the question is, how long have you and your people been away from the motherland? But everybody's Black. And a little girl in elementary school came up with the best definition when the teacher was trying to explain this very complex concept rather to her. She raised her hand and she says, I get it. It's kind of like M&Ms. And the teacher said, in what way? She said, well, you know, we have different colors on the outside, but on the inside, everybody's chocolate. And that's a genetic truth. That's not a Jerry Girley truth. All right. Now we got to get back to the Bible, because this ultimately, Kemet, why are we talking about Kemet? Because it is a place that is figured and discussed largely in the Bible. We know that Joseph spent time in Kemet. He was sold into slavery there. We know that Moses was born there. He spent the first 40 years of his life in Kemet. And I don't think that it was by design, or rather by accident. I think it was by design. I know it was by divine design. And what, if you get the outline, and I'm just going forward for time, what the outline will tell you is that Moses, in the book of Acts, chapter 7, tells us that Moses was learned in all of the knowledge of Egypt. And what was the knowledge of Egypt? Religion, philosophy, science, math, engineering. Moses was quite the accomplished dude. And some of the Old Testament prophets were sheep herders who heard the voice of God in the middle of the pasture one late night while looking at the stars. They were not that refined. They were not that literate, but they fit the bill. They were able to do the job that God called them to do. But Moses wasn't that guy. And I often say this to my daughter and to others who sometimes try to compare themselves to others. You know, the amount of training that you go through in your life is directly correlated to the purpose and the plan that God has for you. The more significant the plan is, the more training you will have to endure. Moses spent 40 years learning science, philosophy, engineering, mathematics, leadership. And then he went into the desert of Midian and he learned how to herd sheep for another 40 years. He spent 80 years of his life training to do a task that took 40 years. Can't compare ourselves, but the training that he underwent was in Kemet. So therefore, Kemet figures largely in the Bible. Now, one more thing I'm going to say about Kemet, then I'm going to jump on to Cush, because today we're only talking about Cush and Kemet, and then we'll kind of build on from there. In the book of Isaiah, and I want to read it to you. I think I'll share this with you. Now, the language is Egypt, but when you see Egypt, I want you to translate that to Cush. I'm going to share this with you, and then that'll be enough in terms of our discussion as far as Kemet is concerned. And we'll talk quickly about Cush.
19. Isaiah 19, starting verse 22. I was trying to get the books.
Isaiah, that's not where I want to be. I want to be, let's see here. Yeah, I'm trying to get you to my outline here. I apologize. And are y'all seeing my face still?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. So what I'm trying to get you to is Isaiah chapter 19, because I think it's so important for you to know that Africa looms largely in the past in terms of God's plan, in the present, and it also looms largely in the future. So I just want to show you this one passage of scripture. I think it's so important for you to see it. I could tell you in summary, but I think you should actually see it. It's that important. So let me get myself over there as well while we're talking. Yeah.
And it's on page 6 in our outline.
Page 6 of your outline, if you have the outline, but I suspect that many people that are actually tuned in for some reason don't have the outline. And let me just tell you that if you,
the link is in the chat. So if you click the links, it's the workbook and the syllabus.
All right, I think I got it up. Do you all see it now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
All right, I want to read this to you because it's important. This is not just to say that Black people is more important to God than other people. That's not what this conversation is about, ladies and gentlemen. You know, when people talk about Black Lives Matter, the sentiment that I take from that is not that Black lives matter more than other lives, but that Black lives matter because the historical message has been that we matter less and that we don't even have a place in God's plan or purpose. So this language, this lesson is about reintroducing us and reacquainting us. In some cases, we are being acquainted for the first time in terms of what the text of the scriptures actually say about the people from Africa. Now, and the Lord shall smite Egypt, or we'll say Kemet. You see that?
Yes.
And he shall smite it and do what else?
Heal it.
Heal it. So God is, when he punishes us, and for whatever reason, Kemet needs to be punished or needed to be punished, God is redemptive. God is not desirous of destroying us. That's not his plan. That's not his preference. So he will smite it and heal it. And they shall do what? Here's the point that I really want to get you to. And they shall do what? What comes after that?
Return.
Now, my question to the class is what does the word return mean? What does it imply? What does it suggest?
That there was an original relationship.
There you go, brother. That sounds like my good brother, Bishop Maurice Paul Brown. Listen, you cannot return to something that you never went to in the first place, or that you never had. You see that? So I mean, that's in the scripture, but we read right past it. So often when we talk about what's happening in Africa, it's like the Europeans are introducing us to a God that we've never known, that we've never had a relationship with, when the scriptures tell us that one day Egypt or Kemet is going to return to God, which means there had to have been a previous relationship there.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that you need to park on that for a moment. Think about that. But let me go on. In that day shall there be a highway out of where? Kemet to Assyria. Where's Assyria geographically? It's northeast of Israel. Okay, so think about that. Iraq. You know where Iraq is today, right?
Mm-hmm.
In that day, there should be a highway that runs from Kemet or Egypt to Iraq. And the Assyrians shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptians into Assyria, and the Egyptians shall serve with the Assyrians. And in that day shall Israel be what? The third with Egypt and Assyria. So God is saying, look, I'm going to do something special with those brothers down in Africa. And they're going to join in with my people in Israel, and they're going to join in with those people that are in Iraq, that are Babylon, Assyria. And even a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless. What's going to happen to us? What's going to happen to the people of Africa in the future? In God's eternal plan, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, blessed be who?
Egypt.
Egypt, or for purposes of our conversation, blessed be who?
Kemet.
Kemet.
So I think we need to understand that Africa is not a throwaway. God has got future plans, great plans, plans that rise to the level. I won't say that the people of Kemet are equal to the Hebrews and God's overall plan of the Jews, but they're right there if I'm reading and interpreting the scripture correctly. Again, because when we talk about Black lives or Black people or African people matter, we're not saying that we matter more. We're saying that we are as important to God as all other people, and this scripture seems to bear that out. It's been in the Bible a long time, folks. But it's just not emphasized because it doesn't fit the narrative and the objectives that certain people have. All right, enough of that. Let's go back. Can you see my mug again?
Yes.
Let's talk about Cush. The thing that I want to tell you quickly about Cush is that Cush was the oldest son of Ham. Cush is a black man. There's no discussion or debate. There is ongoing discussion and debate about whether or not the Egyptians are black or the Kemetic people were black. In my mind, there's no further discussion about it. I'm pretty convinced that they were. I think we can take them at their words. And as I said, Cush has been now defined by the Arabs who came in as the land of the blacks. Okay, so collectively, Cush and Kemet together collectively is the land of the blacks. Well, that makes sense if you have two brothers, right? And I have brothers, right? I have a brother. My oldest brother's name is Ray. My next brother's name is Kurt. If we bought homes next to each other, it wouldn't be that outrageous to call it the land of the Girleys or the street of the Girleys, because we're related. We essentially are the same people. But when Western scholars deal with Egypt, somehow they want to excise it, and they have historically removed it. And if they could, they would geographically remove it from the continent of Africa, but it is connected. It is the same people. We are the same people. So we are in the Bible. Now, Moses married a Cushite woman. How many of you knew that?
Zipporah.
And in fact, he married a Cushite woman, and his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam got with him and criticized him about that, but they ran right into the buzzsaw with God because God was displeased with that. But you got to understand now that Moses grew up in the land of the blacks. We've established that, right? Kemet. You know what happens? Humanity happens. If you hang around black women and you see how beautiful and powerful they are, you might find yourself attracted to one. But what we should understand also, beyond Moses, that several pharaohs actually had mothers that were from Cush. In the lesson, and I want to encourage you to go to Freedom Ministries Facebook page and get the outline and look at the material more closely, because again, we're pushing.
It's in the chat as well.
And I understand it's now in the chat. And we're going to 10:05, and then we're going to start answering some questions that are in the chat.
11:05.
I'm sorry, 11:05. Thank you for correcting me there, boss. Thank you I mean that sincerely. But there were Egypt, and this is in the material, Egypt or Kemet had 30 dynasties over its 3,100 years. What is a dynasty? The dynasty is the rule of a family, okay? Meaning, let's say that Pastor Filmore and his sons and his grandsons set up XYZ country, and they rule it until the Girleys come along and say, we don't like what the Filmores are doing. We're going to throw the last Filmore off the throne, and we're going to put a Girley on the throne. Well, that's the end of the first dynasty, the beginning of a second dynasty. A dynasty is a rule of family. Throughout the history of Kemet, there were 30 dynasties. Now, I want to tell you, we're now into our conversation about Cush. The Kushite Empire went to war with Kemet on many occasions. And there was an extended period of time from about, I'm going to say 1500 BCE, which is before Christ, to around 1097, that Kemet actually came down into Cush and made it one of its colonies for 500 years. Roughly 500 years, Kemet was Cush was under the foot of Kemet. But at the end of that period of time, Kemet fell into one of its intermediate periods, is what we talked about earlier, where the central government begins to disintegrate. And what consistently caused that was that the priests were very powerful people. And the more power they got, the more power they wanted. And if you had a weak pharaoh that was on the throne, then that led to the falling away and the decentralizing of the government. So in that first intermediate period, Cush threw off the slave chains of Kemet and said, we're rising up. Now I need to tell you something else. Kemet had three different capitals in its history. The first capital was a place called Kerma. Kerma came into existence in 2500 BCE. It lasted until 1500 BCE when Kush, or rather Kemet, came down and enslaved and colonized it for that 500-year period. So at the end of that 500-year period, Kush didn't just go away, it reasserted itself. But what it also did is it moved its capital further south down the Nile River to a place called Napta. And Napta was the capital of Kush. Now, from Napta, the kings and the rulers of Kush became increasingly more powerful as the rulers and the pharaohs of Kemet became increasingly weaker. And at some point, there was a moral crisis in Kemet. And as I told you before, this is where it really kind of, now we're getting into the meat of our conversation. The connection that Kemet and Kush had was, first of all, they were the descendants of brothers, okay? So they're essentially the same people. But the second strongest connection that they had was that they believed in the same main God, the invisible one, and the priests of that main God were very powerful people. But at the time that the intermediate period was going on, the priests had become very, very corrupt. Now that's probably a foreign concept to us, right? Corrupt church people.
Well,
They loved money. And one of the things that they were doing is that, see, when the pharaohs were buried, and they were buried with all of their gold, all of their property. So the priests, and they were buried in secret locations, but only the priests knew, because they would have to go in and perform these last rites and rituals. Well, guess what the priests started doing?
Stealing the stuff.
I'm short on money. I know where I can get some money. And that became a thing, and that created a moral crisis. And so there were a considerable amount of the people who lived in Kemet who were very distressed about this. Now the kings in Kush, who were more devout in their devotion and their commitment to their God, to the same God, said, well, hey, look, that's an opening right there. The people are distressed by the fact that morality is going by the wayside, that the priests are corrupt. We can go in and be the champions, be the reformers. We can start a revival, and that's what they did. They marched into Kemet and they took over. Now, keep in mind, because history repeats itself, what I told you a moment ago is that Kemet had come down into Kush and occupied and controlled them for 500 years, and then they became weak. And then Kush rose up and reversed it and marched into Egypt, into Thebes, which was the capital city at that time, and took over and put themselves on the throne and became the black pharaohs that ruled Egypt for 100 years. And that was the 25th dynasty of Kemet. Did you know that in the modern Egyptian museums that they had taken out, and as far as I know, they still have removed, I could be wrong on this, y'all can correct me on this, and we can talk about this later on another conversation, because this is a continuing conversation. But the Egyptians took all references to the 25th dynasty out of their historical records. It is not in dispute that those men were black. But it is inaccurate to say that that was the 25th dynasty is the first time that black people ruled Egypt. But it is the first time that it's not in dispute. But if you know the history of Kemet, and I've given you the material, and I want you to access it and to think about it and bring some additional questions or some concerns to our next conversation, you know that there were probably many different kinds of, or many different pharaohs who were of African origin. If not directly them, their mothers were Cushites. Let's come back to Moses, because that's important. So when Moses married a Cushite woman, it was not a thing to him, you know, because that's what he saw people do all the time. the Kemetic people married with each other, they traded with each other, they fought with each other. So when Moses married a black woman, it wasn't a thing. So Cush was a mighty empire. Cush had male rulers, but did you know they also had female rulers? The Europeans refer to their female rulers as the Candaces. If you are literate and familiar with the biblical text, you know that in the 8th chapter of the book of Acts, there's an Ethiopian eunuch who's reading the prophet Isaiah, and the Spirit tells Philip to join himself with this eunuch. But he's referred to as an Ethiopian eunuch, but he is not an Ethiopian in the sense that we understand who the people of Ethiopia are. The Ethiopians were anybody who lived south of Kemet. The term Ethiopia is not a name that they use to refer to themselves. Once again, where does that name come from? Ethiopia comes from the Greeks. And folks, do you know what it means? Anyone here on the Zoom call knows what the name Ethiopia actually means?
Burnt face people.
The burnt face people. I don't know. I think they meant it as a descriptive. I don't think that they meant it as a pejorative. But I just want to let you know that Ethiopia, whenever the Bible uses Ethiopia, it's referring to Black people generally, to Africans. Okay, that's the point. Okay. So then what was this person that is mentioned in Acts chapter 8 from the country of Ethiopia that we know today? No, absolutely not. It was a person who was likely from Cush. How do we know that? Well, the link point or the reference point is the Candace, the English rendering of the name Candace, but actually in the African, how they refer to the name, it was the Kandaki. The Kandaki was the mother of the ruling king. And sometimes when the king died, the mother continued to rule. Sometimes she ruled in her own respect, in her own regard. There is a lot of history about these Kandakis. The most famous Kandaki is a woman named Amani Reines. Amani Reines fought the Roman Empire on 2 separate occasions and won. Fought the Roman Empire on 2 separate occasions with the Cushite army and won. Well, let me just go to the side for a moment and tell you something about Cush. One name that the Kemet people referred to Cush as is Vile Cush. As I told you, they married, they fought, they traded, but when they were at odds with them, they would refer to them in their writings as Vile Cush. As in, I can't stand them. As in, if I'm speaking in Southern Floridian terms, stank Cush. But another descriptive that they used to describe the people of Cush was Taseti, T-A-S-E-T-I, Taseti. Ta means land in their language. Seti means bow, the land of the bow, as in the bow and arrow. The one thing that the Cushite warriors were prized for, known for worldwide, recruited to fight in the Persian army, the Assyrian army, the Egyptian army at times. They were mercenaries. They were known for being able to shoot people's eyes out, their eyes out, not just shoot them and kill them, hit their body, but they focused on being able to run and hit you at a great distance right in your eye. They called them the pupil smiters. So Rome in 27 BCE came into battle with Cush, the great mighty Roman Empire that had already conquered Egypt, had already conquered all of then known the Western world, all of the countries in the Western world, was marching down to little tiny Cush, but they ran into the pupil spiders, the land of the bows. And you know, the Persians tried it and they ran up on the same problem. The Syrians tried it, they ran up on the same problem. The Greeks tried it and they ran up on the same problem. Cush was a mighty powerful empire. I'm going to tell you that going forward in this conversation, as I said, we're studying 3 Nile civilizations, Nile Valley civilizations: Kemet, Cush, and ultimately Oxum, which today is Ethiopia. Oxum is today's Ethiopia. But of the three, I find myself most impressed, and then this is just the teacher disclosing this to you. I find myself most impressed with Cush, because they really never were conquered in the sense that Egypt was conquered, or in the sense that some of the other empires were conquered. And they were Black, and it's not even a question about whether they were Black. Again, the name Sudan means the Black land. On that point, we're going to slide over to the chat room. I've covered a lot, but if you want to get the crux of what is being discussed, you've got to access the material so that we can further discuss it. I'm now in the chat. I'm just looking to see what's there. I see the workbook is in the chat room. Let me share my screen with you. Are there any questions? We have time now for questions. I want to share 2 short films with you about the things that we've discussed so far. But I do want to allow for some questions. Any questions about what we've discussed?
Yeah, the pupil smiters and the land of the bow, or whatever you said, that
Yes.
sounds kind of like the women on Black Panther.
Yeah, and
Okay,
I think
yeah.
that whoever wrote the Black Panther had some understanding of history, some understanding of Black history. Yeah. Amani Reynes and other Kandakis certainly were in the mold. I tell people that the difference between Wakanda and Kush is that Kush was a real place, and it existed for roughly 3,000 years. The last thing I want to tell you about Kush is that these people were technologically advanced. I know you've never heard of this place, but I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to show you 2 videos. I'm going to show you a video on the Empire of Kush, and I'm going to show you a video on a place called Navda Playa. Navda Playa. Navda Playa is a place that is in the Nubian desert that was found in 1974. It is a remarkable discovery, because what it was the first instance of humans studying the stars that scientists have been able to determine. There are other places on planet Earth where people were studying the stars, but it was much later in time. Navda Playa is 9,000 years old. Back then, these Kushite brothers were calculating the speed of the planets, the distance between the stars, and they were predicting the coming of the monsoon, the rain seasons. They had a calendar that they created 9,000 years ago. And why is all of that important? Because we were told, they were teaching in 1970 that Africa has no history, no appreciable history. That we were a bunch of savages running around in the jungles with spears. And that the only enlightenment and knowledge that we have is the knowledge that they imparted to us. And it's just not historically true. That's the whole point of all of this. And it's not true because God had a plan for the people of Africa. I've shown you in the text, I've shown you in the Bible, that God was working in Africa from the beginning. He's working there now. We'll talk about that on another day. And at the end of the matter, God will be working in Africa. There will be a highway, that's what Isaiah tells us, from Africa through Israel and into Iraq. Think about that. I'm going to the chat. Give me 1 second. I have to stop sharing that part of it. Okay, there are comments. I'm sorry. Someone told me there are comments. I need to go back. I apologize, guys. I'm trying to navigate this.
Doing a great job, sir.
Yes, excellent.
I appreciate it. Let's see. Inez says, how do I get an outline? Sister Inez, if you're there, you can go to our Freedom Ministries. Okay. And it's actually there. If you click on it, if you're in the chat, if you go to the chat and you click on it, you'll access it that way. Lynn says, this is powerful. We are his chosen people. Yes. Ruth says, excellent. And Ruth also says, thanks for the workbook info. Thank you all for tuning in. Let's see here. Who else? Okay. All right. So now let's get over to this material, and then we'll be done for this morning. Now, guys, again, all I'm trying to do is whet your appetite. I mean, I am a student of this topic, and I in my wildest dream, in my wildest imagination, what I'm hoping for is to light your imagination and your interests, and to cause you, using the material as a gateway, to go do further inquiry. If you will do that, I think you're going to be able to come back and teach me some stuff. Once again, y'all see me? Y'all see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. I am going to the video. This video is about Navda Playa, the place that I told you about, that where they discovered that Black people created this calendar and it was studying the stars and the planets 9,000 years ago. And this just goes to the point that we have a very impressive future, or rather past, but if we only see ourselves as the descendants of slaves, then we're losing the battle, because we will always see ourselves through that lens, and our capacity is interpreted through that lens. And so one of the things that we're trying to accomplish here in this conversation is to expand your scope of who you are and where you come from, and what God has done through us in times past. All right, here we go. Bear with me.
I've never felt so close.
Give
to
me
the
1 second
possibility
once I
of
clear this
destruction.
little.
The Nephilim, the Jack.
What do y'all see? You see the video?
We see the video.
All right.
The Napta Playa.
See the earth.
The Nubian Empire was established in 4800 BC. The Nubian Empire was located in northeastern Africa, in the area which is today known as Sudan. Later, the capitals of the Nubian Empire would be Kerma, Napata, and Meroe. Now, the ancient Nubians were known to have deeply studied astronomy. Astronomy is the scientific study of the cosmos, which includes the analysis of star systems, planets, moons, and galaxies. These Africans studied the stars and developed detailed astronomical knowledge, which they documented in monuments and artifacts. The Nubians also tracked the precession of the stars and their movements. One of the more well-known astronomical monuments they created is the Napta Playa, which is also known as the world's oldest astronomical observatory. The Navda Playa complex is located near Nabda in the Nubian Desert in East Africa. The Navda Playa consists of a series of stone circles, stone slabs, buried rocks with carvings and structures. The stone structures are astronomically aligned to the stars, including the seven-star constellation known as the Big Dipper, the Orion constellation, and the star Sirius. It is understood that Nubians utilized the Napta Playa as a type of star map to guide themselves across the desert. Within the Napta Playa, we have find a stone circle, which it is understood was used by these Africans to mark a specific celestial events, namely the summer solstice, which is associated with the onset of summer rains. The stone circle is 4 meters in diameter and is made up of 4 pairs of stones and a series of smaller stones. Connected within the center of the circle are 2 rows of 3 stones. It is now understood that the southern row of the 3 stones represent the 3 stars of Orion's belt. Orion's belt consists of 3 very bright stars, named Al-Natakum, Al-Nalam, and Minitaka, which are between 1340 and 1200 light years away from the planet Earth. Nearby to the stone circle, the Nubians developed another larger series of stone structures from rock, some of which weigh several tons. These megaliths are understood to be aligned to the star called Alpha Ursae Majoris, which is part of the Ursa Major star constellation. The Nubians of East Africa are remembered in history as some of the earliest and most advanced astronomers on planet Earth.
Hmm.
Okay, folks. The whole point of that is we weren't just running around throwing spears and hiding in caves. We were doing advanced science, and we were doing it accurately. And we were doing it before all other people. And this honor of being the first astronomers is often given to the people of Sumer, which we referenced earlier in this conversation earlier today. Well, assuming that that's true, which I don't think it is, because the Sumerians, if you know their history, their empire at the earliest existed at 5000 BCE. If you click on some of the links and go in and further look at this conversation about Navda Playa, you see that this was something that was going on 9,000 years ago. That's what makes it remarkable. Africa is also sometimes referred to as the dark continent, right? And there's really nothing that is positive that is implied when they make that reference. Dark in knowledge, dense in ability to comprehend, in darkness, not ever having had any connection to God. All of that is implied, not having developed anything. And what we're seeing is that the objective and the empirical evidence is something quite to the contrary. But we haven't learned that. We're not learning that today so that we can stick our chests out, but we're learning that so that we can stop holding our head down. Because we've been socialized, we've been conditioned to hold our heads down, to think that we're ever so slightly inferior or less capable than the next guy. And I think God is just wanting to bring us to the truth about who we are and what he's doing and has done through us and what he's planning to do. Now, folks, I think there may be one more comment in the chat, and then we're going to be done. It says, hopefully at some point we can further connect these lessons with further understanding of the chosen people concept of why God have or need a chosen people. Came in late, not sure if there is any already discussed about the chosen people or if it's off topic. Well, Sister Jill, nothing is off topic in this conversation, because I don't present myself as the czar of information and the dictator of the class. I'm the facilitator. Just so that you can know how I'm approaching this class is how I approach any class that I teach, which is, I think of us on a bus together. We're on a field trip. And occasionally we may see some flowers over there in the forest, and we may want to park the bus and get our picnic blanket and our sandwiches and go over and sit down and talk. I'm just the bus driver. We're all passengers. We're all traveling to a destination, which is higher understanding, higher knowledge of self, and more importantly, higher knowledge of who God is and what he's doing through us. Who's his chosen people? Well, Jillian, I don't know if you looked at the discussion or you were in when we read Isaiah 19. And if I would encourage you, if you don't have a copy of the syllabus, it's in the chat. You can click on it. You can go to Freedom Ministries page. But the conversation that we had relative to Isaiah 19 tells us that, typically when people talk about the chosen people, that's God's chosen people being the Hebrews. What I understand about that, Sister Jill, and I'm welcome to know what your thoughts are and anyone else's thoughts, is that Israel is chosen in one respect, to be in a prototypical relationship that demonstrates the kind of relationship that God wants to have with all human beings. And sometimes historically, biblically, if I'm understanding the Old Testament correctly, the Hebrews got it wrong. They thought, well, because we are quote unquote God's chosen people, he won't let anything happen to us. When we use the term chosen, the next question that has to follow that is chosen to do what? Because the empire of Babylon was chosen by God. Did you know that? That Jeremiah referred to Nebuchadnezzar, who was a heathen in every respect of the term, as God's chosen instrument. So when we say chosen, that doesn't necessarily mean perfect people or righteous people who have it all together. The next question that must follow is chosen to do what? Now, it is my understanding that as it relates to the Hebrews, chosen to be in a prototypical relationship, to be instruments in God's hand, but God has chosen all who will accept his gift of grace. We can talk about that further. I'm trying to be true to my promise, which is that this conversation ends at 11:30, and it has to end at 11:30 because I have to also go over to the church and speak this morning at Freedom Ministries at 12 o'clock. So I've got to get my wheels running and rolling in just a minute. But I appreciate the question. It's a good question. We don't ask those kinds of questions enough. There are no questions class that's off limit in this conversation. The object of, from my point of view, of this class and any other class is to make you think. I don't want you to think like me. I don't want you to become a Jerry Girley clone. I don't think that you would enjoy being me. Sometimes I don't enjoy being me. It's not what this is about. It's about in promoting learning, thinking, looking at all sources of information that we have available and trying to come to some conclusion about what God's plan is for us collectively moving forward. And I just have to say that because we're doing this in the context of Black History Month, it seems that, I think in my mind, intentionally, or at least as lawyers like to say, recklessly, God's plan for us, God's treatment of us, meaning people of color, Black people, has been given limited attention, and in some cases intentionally ignored or distorted. So one of the things that we're doing here is we're trying to reintroduce, and in some instances, acquaint for the first time what the Bible says and what history says about God's involvement with Black people. And in the context of this conversation, Africa's contribution to the people and the places of the Bible. Thank you all for attending. There are some preview questions that are there, and that's just to kind of more or less focus you on the material, to invite you to do further inquiry, further learning. Thank you, everyone.